Well, good morning, all. This is Kathy Dwyer. I'm calling in from the Zobrio offices out of Boston. I'd like to welcome everybody to our 1099 year-end processing webinar. What the goal is today is to discuss some preliminary steps that you can take to prepare for your 1099, and so we'll have some successful reporting. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, let's discuss how the Fundware system handles 1099s. Well, the concept is this, is in your live database, you have a vendor file and you have vendor history. And what ends up happening is we quite literally create a 1099 database. And what we do is we extract information from your live vendor and your live vendor history file, and we create a separate 1099 database. And what ends up happening with that database is from here you can edit, which means you can add, you can delete, you can modify. And the benefit of having a separate or alternative database is it is based on all your live data, but you can change names and addresses, and it's only affecting your 1099 reporting where your vendor file stays pristine. So think in terms of maybe vendors that are DBAs, where you have maybe one name in the vendor file, but you want to put a separate name on your 1099 form. That editing can take place in the 1099 database. Okay. Now, here's the concept is, again, you've got a gigantic vendor file, and most likely, and some of your vendors are 1099 eligible, some are not. Well, what we do is we extract information out of the vendor file, and it's not everybody. We need to isolate who. Okay. So because of that, because we're extracting information on the basis of the vendor file, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's required of that vendor file. Okay. So first of all, the slide we're looking at right now is the first screen within the vendor file. And what we want to mention is the sort key doubles as what we call a 1099 name control, which is a value that's required to go into the electronic file. And what it basically represents is it's the first 4 characters of a company name or an individual's last name. And if you have more than 4 characters, that's quite fine too, because the system is just going to truncate those characters when it comes time to creating your electronic file. But that is an absolute. If you're a 1099 eligible vendor, you must have a sort key. Again, no punctuation, and kind of focus on the first 4 characters. Okay. Next, what happens is when we swing over to the Notes tab, okay, we mentioned we're creating a database, a separate database of 1099 vendors. Well, how do we choose some vendors and not others? Well, for the most part, the majority of clients use the Notes tab to identify whether a vendor is 1099 eligible, and secondly, whether or not they have a tax ID number. Okay. Now, which note fields you use are not necessarily restrictive. You could put your tax ID in note field 1, you could put it in note field 2, any note field, but you just got to be aware of which note field is where your tax ID resides and be consistent across your database. So every vendor, if you choose the note 1 field to have your tax ID, then ensure that all vendors have their tax ID in note field 1. Okay. For this particular example, I'm displaying 2 separate note fields. I'm saying note 1 is if I'm a 1099 eligible vendor, I put in the code 1099. If not 1099 eligible, I leave it blank. And then as you can see, the ID or tax ID is in note field 3. And you do want to use the punctuation, whether it's a federal ID or your social security number. Use your dashes, because exactly how you format it here is how it will appear on the form itself. Okay. If in some cases you just use a single field, what we've seen is perhaps note field 1 having a tax ID, and if you're a non-1099 vendor, you might put the letter C in front of the ID number to indicate that you're a corporation. But think of it in terms of this, is we need, for the 1099s, a tax ID, and we need the ability to say, who are we extracting from our live database into our 1099 database? And at this point, we're not applying the $600 limit. We're simply saying these are the eligible vendors. Okay. So this is probably the most popular use of the note fields when it comes to 1099s is, at a minimum, we need your tax ID. There is an alternative method of identifying tax IDs and 1099 eligibility, and that is through the Vendor Data Items tab. And this particular screenshot is showing you the first entry is a vendor data item that basically just indicates that this is a 1099 vendor. And then a second field there is your tax ID, where we hold just that as the tax number, whether, again, it's an 04 or a federal ID versus a Social Security number. Again, note that you can use either the Notes tab or the Vendor Data Items tab. You don't have to use both. Okay. So that's the initial setup, as you're looking at your vendor file, to have a sort key and a place, whether it be the Note tab or the Data Items tab, to identify a tax ID number. Okay. Also, just worth passing to is when we extract and create the 1099 database, what the system is pulling is your main name and your main address. So when you think about your vendor file, you have a name and an alternate name. You have an address and an alternate address. The system is designed to pull from the main fields. So again, if this needs to be some editing, keep in mind you don't necessarily have to edit your vendor file and then just to edit it for 1099s and turn around and put it back when you get back to check printing. You can make those edits in the 1099 database, and again, it only affects 1099s and keeps your 1090 or your vendor file pristine. Okay. So that's the first concept, is we're creating the 1099 database. Do note that oftentimes you'll pay vendors through the one-time vendor option, which simply means you're paying them without a vendor number. In Fundware, if you don't have a vendor number, then what happens is there's nothing to extract into your 1099 database. However, keep in mind, because we can edit the 1099 database, we can always locate these vendor payments by running the invoice summary report, OT-SUM, and with that information, we can turn around and key those vendors manually into the 1099 database itself. Okay. So there is a way to handle those one-time vendors. Going forward, we certainly would recommend setting up a vendor file for those vendors if they meet that criteria, whether 1099 eligible or not. Okay. Now, from here, once you create that 1099 database, that's from which the database in which the forms are printed. And with the Fundware software, you can create 1099 miscellaneous and or 1099 interest forms. Just keep in mind, if you're fall within both categories, you need some for the miscellaneous and some for the 1099 interest, it is important that you complete a full cycle of all your 1099 miscellaneouses, which means extract the database, do your edits, print your forms, create the electronic file, and then what you do is you essentially initialize the 1099 database and repeat the process for your 1099 interest forms. You create your database, you edit, you print, and create your electronic file. Okay. So that, I would say at that point, the biggest service you can do in creating the 1099s is look at your vendor file, make sure that that's prepared ahead of time. Okay. The second piece of information that you want to look at in terms of setup is the 1099 parameter file. Okay. Now, the parameter file, there's basically one there for 1099 interest and 1099 miscellaneous. And again, it will hold certain demographic data like who you are and your tax ID, and it will also hold default 1099 boxes. And by that I mean when you pitch your 1099 form, there's different boxes for different categories of payments. For the most part, I think you'll find for the 1099 miscellaneous, your purchases will accumulate into non-employee compensation. For your interest income or your 1099 INTs, the default purchases or the purchases are going to default into the interest income box. Again, you want probably the lion's share. If you have 80% go into non-employee compensation, we'll load everything into the non-employee compensation. And because you have the ability to edit that 1099 database, we go back in and you can reclassify expenses from one category to another if that is the case. Okay. Now, from here, once we have our database and we know that we can add and change and get ready to actually physically print the forms, what you need to keep in mind is somewhere within the last week, typically the last week of December, Blackbaud is going to release a year-end service pack. And again, this service pack is what it will do is contain software changes. Perhaps the form has been redesigned or there's new fields that need to be added. This is a preliminary step to actually going live and extracting and creating the database, making your edits. We want to make sure we have that software in place. So what we do is we pull it off of the Blackbaud website, download, and install. Okay. Forms, preliminary also, is to preparing for printing the 1099s, you'll need some forms. In this slide at the top, you'll see a phone number that you can call and also an email address, which is, these are forms that are supported by the software. So this is a recommended vendor. This is Blackbaud's Forms division, and these forms will indeed fit the 1099s themselves. And pretty much the form is just a 3-up, meaning when you look at it portrait, it's copy 1, copy 2, copy 3. You have a little bit of options when it comes to the envelopes and self-sale, single window, double window, and it really relates to the cost option and what you want to do there. Now, in terms of printing and filing the forms in the electronic file, you can see here the 131 is when we need to have the forms printed and out to the various vendors. Electronic filing at the bottom there is due by the end of March. What I like to recommend here with your electronic filing is hold off. Don't be in a rush to file or to that particular file to the Social Security Administration, the IRS. Hold off on that just a bit, because oftentimes you'll send out your paper copies to the vendors and you might hear back from them, hey, this was a reimbursement, maybe the amount's too high. They might have some complaint about the form. And this affords you the opportunity to go back into the database. If you agree with the complaint, make the change and reprint the 1099 itself. Easy to do that. The change will reflect in the electronic file, and then you don't get involved with 1099-C corrections. So it's almost wait to the middle of March before you really want to file that, and that way you can jump in and get any corrections that need to be done. Okay. This slide just discusses some upcoming webinars that we have scheduled. For those folks that have a year-end, or is it timely to talk about a general ledger fiscal year-end, next week we do have a webinar that will discuss some important topics there. And the first week in December we have an IT seminar, as you can see here, and we'll welcome attendees. Now, what ends up happening is we do offer service to come on site, or offer remote service where we can assist in the generation of your 1099s. Matt Kreuzer is his phone number and email is displayed here on the slide. Please feel free to give him a call and get some training, or it's not really training, it's more assistance. We'll be there to assist in the generation of your 1099s. Okay. Just hold that up for a bit so everybody gets his number and email. Okay. Now, this brings us up to the question session, or a portion of the webinar. And if anybody has any questions that they want to type in, or if you feel more comfortable, speak right up and we'll go ahead and answer any questions you have. Also, if you prefer, my email address is Kathy, K-A-T-H-Y, Dwyer, D-W-Y-E-R, at Zobrio.com. Feel free, if you have any questions about the process, to give me, drop me an email, call me up, anything, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. But your biggest issue with your 1099s is the vendor file preparation. Okay. And again, keep in mind, it's never too early to start. You can go in and get that file. You can run your summary history reports out of the AP system and start getting a list of your vendors and preparing for your post-1231 forms and file creation. Okay. So any questions before we end out? Okay then. Well, I appreciate everybody attending, and again, feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions. Hope to see you in some future classes. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.